UFOs, Pyramids, and the 12th Planet. Lecture at the UFO Conference at the Great Pyramid, January 1992. Over the years, Zecharia Sitchin has often been asked to speak at various conferences. In January 1992, he spoke at the UFO Conference at its meeting at the site of the Great Pyramid in Giza, Egypt. In this talk, he explains how his interest in what would become his lifelong passion began. He talks about how, early on, he learned to forge a trail of discovery that would further solidify the development of his theories about the Anunnaki, the ancient visitors who came to Earth roughly 445,000 years ago, and, in doing so, changed the course of human evolution. One facet of this story presented here involves the legends of the Greek gods, while another discusses the famous Alexander the Great, in what is an examination by Sitchin of who Alexander really was. We then turn to photos taken by NASA in 1986 and 1989 that provide very real evidence that accounts in the ancient texts describing our planets in their courses and their formation, heretofore deemed to be myth, were based on actual fact. At every step of the way, Sitchin's careful scrutiny of the archaic texts of Mesopotamia corroborates the biblical records, including, and as farther articulated in this chapter, accounts of UFOs. Sitchin also explains who built the Giza pyramids and what their real function was. Part and parcel of this discussion is the exposing of scholarly frauds by Sitchin, frauds that were perpetuated by some of the pyramid's early investigators who were in search of fame and glory for themselves, and not necessarily the truth. Whenever I am asked about UFOs, what do I think about UFOs? Do I believe they exist? Do I believe the people who encountered them? I am ready with my own UFO story. It is one about a young man who was hiking from his hometown to another place. As it got dark at the end of the day, he lay down to sleep in the field. In the middle of the night he was awakened, not by noises, but by bright lights. Half asleep, half blinded by the bright light, he saw a UFO. It was hovering above the ground. A ladder or steps were coming down from an open hatch or doorway reaching to the ground. Some of the occupants of the UFO were going up and down this ladder. He could see their commander, standing in the open door, silhouetted against the light inside, and, overcome with awe and fear, the young man fainted. When he came to, the UFO was gone, but the young man knew what he had seen. Here is what he had realized. Indeed, he said to himself, the Lord is present in this place, and I knew it not. How awesome is this place! It must be the place of the gods, and this is their gateway to heaven. Now what should we make of this story? What would you think if the young man would have rushed in here and told us all that? What would the media make of it? Would they ridicule it, or report it as a truthful experience? As it happens, the tale has been reported in a publication that I consider very, very reliable. It is called the Bible. And as some of you might have guessed, the story that I told you is the so-called Jacob's Dream. It is one UFO encounter about which I have no doubts, because I am a great believer in the veracity of the Hebrew Bible. This UFO report, in chapter 28 of Genesis, contains a great deal of important information. It shows us that in biblical times people were awed, but not mystified, by the phenomenon which nowadays is called the UFO enigma. To Jacob, what he had seen was not a UFO, an unidentified flying object, but one that he did identify at once. He knew what it was, and he realized at once that he had inadvertently chosen as his rest place for the night a spot that was adjacent to a UFO base. He knew that the vehicle was operated by the gods, and he realized that this was their gateway to heaven. Jacob's vision is not the only biblical tale of flying craft coming from and disappearing into the skies. There is the story of the fiery chariot that carried the prophet Elijah to heaven, and the story of the flying machine that the prophet Ezekiel had seen. Such stories illustrate the point that I wish to impress upon you. If you believe in the Bible, you must accept the possibility of UFOs. As a matter of fact, it is thanks to the Bible that I am addressing you today. I am sure that each one of us can recall an event, a moment to which they can trace their interest in the subject that has brought us together here, at the foot of the Great Pyramid. Mine was an incident when I was a schoolboy studying the Old Testament in its original Hebrew language. We reached chapter 6 of Genesis, the story of the deluge, the great flood. The tale of Noah and the ark is preceded by several very enigmatic verses. They tell us of the days preceding the deluge. We read that those were the days when the sons of the gods, sons in the plural, gods in the plural, were upon the earth. They married the daughters of man and had offspring by them. Those enigmatic sons of the gods are called in those verses Nephilim, and the teacher explained that the term meant giants. But young Sitchin raised his hand and asked the teacher, "Why do you say giants when the word Nephilim means in Hebrew those who came or descended to earth, presumably from the heavens?" Instead of commending me for my linguistic perception, the teacher reprimanded me. "Sitchin, sit down," he said. "You don't question the Bible." The reprimand hurt me, for I was not questioning the Bible. On the contrary, I was trying to point out the true meaning of the Bible's words, and it was that childhood incident that kept churning within me and that, as I grew up, prompted me to search for the identity of the Nephilim. Who were those people? Why did the Bible describe them by a term that indicated they were not of this earth, but had come down to us from the heavens? Why was such a great distinction made between them and the females called the daughters of man? Why were they called the sons of the gods? And how could the Bible, preaching in one great and omnipotent God, speak of many sons of many gods? My first steps in a lifelong search were into the field of biblical scholarship. I found the first important clue, quite unexpectedly, in the commentaries of a 19th century scholar in Russia. This is what he had to say regarding the Nephilim. In ancient times, the rulers of countries were the sons of deities who arrived upon the earth from the heavens, and they ruled the earth and married wives from among the daughters of man. They were the sons of deities who, in the earliest times, came down from the heavens upon the earth, and that is why they called themselves Nephilim, meaning those who fell down. The scholar, known as Malbim, quickly added that these were tales of pagan gods, which should be of no interest to a devout person who believes in a one and only God. This Malbim, I found out, was basing his commentary on what we call mythology, and what is better known than the mythology of the Greeks, with their tales of those wonderful Olympian gods, 12 of them, and their sons and daughters, who did cavort with the offspring of men. What a wonderful bunch they were! On the one hand, so divine, seemingly immortal, able to roam the skies, armed with weapons that emit beams or shake the earth with lightning bolts, and on the other hand, so human-like, loving and hating, sleeping and mating. One of the most important sacred places of ancient Greece was Delphi, dedicated to the god Apollo, and site of the most known oracle goddesses. Nowadays, the visitors walk up what is called the Sacred Way, and can see the ancient omphalos stone and stand where the ancient priests and worshippers stood. But hardly anyone of the modern visitors stops to think that, 2,500 years ago, those who went there were not curiosity seekers, but believers. They were people to whom those ancient gods were not a myth, but a reality. People were certain that they were worshipping actual divine beings, gods who indeed from heaven to earth came, and the way they had come here to earth was in flying machines that we nowadays, out of ignorance of what history teaches us, call unidentified flying objects, UFOs. In the land where we are now, in ancient Egypt, the same beliefs prevailed. The Egyptians also believed in gods who had come to Earth from another planet, a planet called in Egyptian hieroglyphic texts, planet of millions of years. They called those gods Neteru, a word that meant the guardians, and they wrote in their histories that before the pharaohs, the human kings, Egypt was ruled by demigods, the offspring of intercourse between the gods and human females. And before that, only gods ruled in the valley of the Nile. These were beliefs that were uncannily similar to the biblical references to the Nephilim. One who was certain that the tales were true was the famed Greek conqueror Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BC, he came to these lands in search of immortality. He did so because he was convinced that he was entitled to live as long as the gods, and the reason was the rumors in the Macedonian court that the real father of Alexander was not his father Philip, but an Egyptian god who, disguised, came one night into Alexander's mother's quarters and there fathered the future conqueror. The name of that Egyptian god was Ammon-Ra, meaning Ra, the Hidden One. Fighting his way through Asia Minor, today's Turkey, and the lands that are now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, Alexander reached Egypt. His very first stop, was at a city called by the Egyptians Anu, and known to us from the Hebrew Bible by the name On. The Greeks called it City of the Sun, Heliopolis. There is a shrine dedicated to the great god. There was on display the actual object in which the god had come to earth from the heavens, his so-called celestial boat. It was a well-known shrine, and once a year its Holy of Holies was opened to admit the pharaoh to see the sacred object. Thousands of pilgrims were gathered at Heliopolis at that time, not unlike the thousands who come once a year to Mecca to venerate the Kaaba, the sacred black stone. No one knows where that object, the celestial boat, has vanished to, or when it disappeared. Indeed, one theory is that it was taken to Mecca, and that it was placed within the large box-like structure that houses the Kaaba, and which no one can ever enter. But we do know how that object looked, because a small stone replica of it was discovered by archaeologists. What Alexander went to see, and what he did see, was a UFO, except that for him, as for Jacob 1500 years earlier, it was not an unidentified flying object, but the remains of a very identifiable command module of a spacecraft. Where was this shrine with its own space museum? Where was Heliopolis? Right here, within easy reach of where we are now. Today its name is retained only as that of an eastern suburb of Cairo, a faint echo of what was once a glorified and venerated sacred place, and as now, then too it was in the proximity of the plateau of Giza and its 3 unique pyramids and the no less unique Sphinx. Before we turn our attention to the pyramids and the Sphinx, we have to follow in the footsteps of Alexander in our, and his, search for the identity of the gods and the meaning and purpose of the monuments they had left behind. As detailed in my second book, The Stairway to Heaven, Alexander went from Heliopolis to a shrine in the western desert, where he heard an oracle confirm his semi-divine lineage. But in order to gain the immortality to which he felt entitled, he was to find the gateway of the gods. The directions given him by the Egyptian priests led him to the Sinai Peninsula. There he followed a maze of subterranean passages and encountered amazing artifacts and sights. But when he reached a place of mysterious radiance, his way was blocked by an angel. The angel told him the meaning of the oracle's words. The gateway of the gods, Alexander was told, was the literal meaning of the name of the city called Babylon. Its ancient name, Babel, meant exactly that, gateway of the gods. It will be there, the angel told Alexander, that he would find the god Ra, who, in Babylon, was known as Marduk. Finally arriving in Babylon, Alexander did come face to face with the god who, according to the rumors, was his real father. But the great god who was supposed to grant Alexander immortality was dead. What Alexander had found was the god embalmed in his tomb, and only then did Alexander understand the true oracle. He, like the gods, was fated to die in the end. He would become immortal, but only by being remembered. So, to assure that, he built cities called Alexandria wherever he went. The Greeks, one discovers in studying their tales, indeed asserted that their gods came from across the Mediterranean Sea. Their gods, they admitted, were no different from those of the Egyptians and the Phoenicians, of the Canaanites and of the Hittites. Indeed, as archaeologists have uncovered the remains of those ancient Near Eastern civilizations and cultures, and scholars were able to decipher their writings, it became evident that all the tales we call mythologies are renderings and versions of much earlier tales that were first recorded on clay tablets in a land called in the Bible Shinar. Scholars call it by the name it was called in the clay tablets, Shumer. It meant literally land of the guardians, the very term that in Egyptian, Neteru, was applied to the gods. The name is written in English Sumer, rather than the more accurate Shumer. Mythology, tales of the gods of heaven and earth, all began there. When archaeologists began to unearth the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, they found Nineveh. That was the capital of Assyria, and Babylon, capital of the Babylonians, both first known to us from the Bible and of other ancient places. Those discoveries took the scholars back 3,000 and 4,000 years to the first and second millennia BC, but the Bible explicitly spoke of cities and civilizations that preceded Assyria and Babylon, and the scholars of the time just could not believe that was possible. Once again, the veracity of the Bible was questioned. But as we now know, after some 150 years of archaeological progress, the Bible was proven right. The more archaeologists moved south in the great plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, towards the Persian Gulf, the older were the remains they dug up. They also came upon inscriptions in a language that preceded that of Assyria and Babylon. Then the earliest cities mentioned in the Bible, like Erech and the city of Abraham, were discovered. And so it was that Sumer was brought back to light. Mankind's first great civilization, it blossomed out an incredible 6,000 years ago. We tend to think of human progress as a gradual process. The fact that puzzles all scholars is that in Shumer or Sumer, a high civilization blossomed out suddenly, unexpectedly, out of nowhere. Without a precedent or a gradual process, there sprang out great cities, high-rise temples, palaces, courts of justice, commerce, shipping, irrigation, metallurgy, mathematics, and medicine. All of a sudden, as if waved in by a magic wand, there appeared kings and priests, judges and doctors, dancers, musicians, artists and artisans, and above all, a written language, scribes, schools, a literature, epic tales, poems, proverbs, libraries. Every aspect of a high civilization that we can think of had its beginning in Sumer. Of the hundreds of illustrations in my 5 books to date, I offer up a few here. The first to use bricks and kilns in which to dry and harden them. The Sumerians built step pyramids called ziggurats that rose by stages to greater heights. Editor's note: please see illustration A on facing page for an example of a ziggurat. Inventing the first rotary press, the Sumerian craftsmen cut from a hard stone small cylinders on which they engraved in reverse various depictions. When these were rolled on wet clay, A positive of the drawing was impressed on the clay and became a permanent picture from antiquity. Thousands of such cylinder seals have been found, giving us an accurate graphic record of the Sumerians, their daily lives, their religion, and the way they and their gods looked. Many statues and statuettes, exquisitely crafted, depict for us both gods and their worshippers. In illustration B, you can see how a Sumerian lady looked, how elegantly she was dressed, how noble her demeanor was. Above all, the most important legacy were the tens of thousands of inscribed tablets. C is an example that recorded commercial and marital contracts, payments of taxes, temple inventories, or, on the other hand, recorded lists of gods and kings, and historical and prehistorical events, or provided advanced scientific texts indicating an amazingly sophisticated knowledge. Most amazing of all was the Sumerian knowledge of astronomy. The astonishing fact is that all the principles of spherical astronomy, which is the basis of modern astronomy, were inherited by us from the Sumerians. The concept of a celestial sphere, an axis, the plane of orbit, the circle of 360 degrees, the grouping of stars into constellations, the division of the skies into 12 houses of the zodiac, even the names and pictorial depictions of the zodiacs, all that comes to us from the Sumerians. We learn at school that the first one to suggest that the sun, not the earth, was in the center of our solar system was Copernicus in 1543. Not so. Not only did the Sumerians know the true nature of our solar system, they even depicted it. How could the Sumerians have known all that 6,000 years ago? We have learnt in school that the ancient peoples knew only of the sun, moon, and 5 planets, that they were not aware of any planets beyond Saturn simply because they could not see them. Well, here we find the Sumerians depicting not only Uranus and Neptune, which are way beyond Saturn, but even the farthest out, Pluto. This is truly astounding, because we ourselves did not know more than the Greeks or Romans until the invention of the telescope. Uranus was discovered in 1781, some 200 years ago. Neptune in 1846, 150 years ago. It is a measure of how far behind ancient knowledge we have been, if it is realized that when Neptune was discovered, archaeologists had already unearthed the Mesopotamian tablets with the astronomical information that included not only Uranus and Neptune, but also Pluto, and we discovered Pluto only in 1930, just some 60 in 1930. Let me increase the puzzle. In August 1977, a year after my first book, The 12th Planet, was published, NASA, the U.S. space agency, launched 2 spacecraft named Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 toward Jupiter, Saturn, and beyond. In 1986, Voyager 2 flew by Uranus and sent back man's first ever photos and other close-up data on Uranus, which is 2 billion miles away from us. In August 1989, Voyager 2 reached Neptune, and again provides us with the first ever breathtaking pictures and other data of the planet, twice as distant from us as Uranus. In both instances, as I watched the NASA televised transmissions, I literally jumped out of my seat and shouted, "Oh my God! That is exactly how the Sumerians had described the 2 planets 6,000 years ago. Blue-green, twin-like, watery." On page 243 of the original English edition of the 12th Planet, published a year before the spacecraft were even launched, I quote the Sumerian text describing each planet, and the ancient text fits perfectly with the astounding NASA discoveries. Once again, the question is, how could the Sumerians know all that? The answer lies in the number 12. I have already mentioned that ancient pantheons were headed by 12 Olympian gods, but the celestial number 12 also applied to the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles of Jesus, the 12 zodiacs, the 12 months of the year, and so on. Why 12? To match the number of members of the solar system, the Sumerians explained. Besides the sun and moon, there are not 9, but 10 other planets, they insisted. They called that 12th member of the solar system Nibiru. Its name meant Planet of the Crossing, and its symbol was the cross. A long text known by its opening line, Enuma Elish, details the Sumerian cosmogony, describes the process by which planets formed around the sun, details the arrival of an invader from outer space, a celestial collision, the formation of our Earth, and the origin of the moon. In my latest book, Genesis Revisited, I show that the Sumerian text provides answers to many aspects of the solar system that still puzzles our scientists, and that much of what we have found out in the last decades actually is no more than catching up with ancient knowledge. Many astronomers are convinced that such an additional planet does, in fact, exist. They call it Planet X. Some admit that there is not much more to do but let the fact be known and name the planet. I, on my part, believe that the first confirmation took place in 1983, and have written to the International Astronomical Union in Paris, insisting that the planet be called by its Sumerian name, Nibiru. The existence of Nibiru explains the source of the amazing Sumerian knowledge. As if to preempt the questions, the Sumerians themselves repeatedly stated, "All that we know," they said, "was taught to us by the Anunnaki." The name literally meant, "those who from heaven to earth came," the exact meaning of the Hebrew term Nephilim that the Bible used, and the Sumerians, in text after text, described how those Anunnaki had in fact come to earth, traveling in space from Nibiru, coming and going between their planet and ours every 3,600 years, when Nibiru, in its great elliptical orbit around the sun, passes between Mars and Jupiter. The saga of the arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth 450,000 years ago, and their activities here read as science fiction. As noted previously, scholars call these detailed texts myths, but I have asked myself, what if? What if these are not imagined stories, but rather accurate records of actual happenings? In my books, which have the overall title of the Earth Chronicles, I have recreated from those texts a compelling scenario of the ancient events, illustrated with hundreds of depictions found in archaeological discoveries. I can give you here only a brief summary of that history and prehistory of Earth and mankind. The first group of 50 visitors to Earth, led by a brilliant scientist called Enki, splashed down in the Persian Gulf, waded ashore, and established near the present-day city of Basra, Iraq, their first settlement. They called it Eridu, meaning home in the far away. It is the source of the name by which we call our planet, Erde in the Indo-European languages, Eretz in the Semitic languages, Eartha, earth in English, and so on. The Anunnaki came to Earth for gold, not to be used in jewelry or ornaments, but in order to create, on their own planet, a shield of suspended gold particles with which to protect their dwindling atmosphere. The first plan, to extract the gold from the waters of the Persian Gulf, did not succeed, so they went to Southeast Africa and began to obtain the gold by mining it. At some point, the time is exactly stated in the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki assigned to the mines mutinied. What were their leaders to do? Enki, the chief scientist, had a solution. From a being that already exists on Earth, let us call it an ape-man, a more intelligent primitive worker could be created, he said. And the text then describes a process of genetic engineering, whereby the genes of a young Anunnaki were mixed with the egg of a female ape woman to create the atom. The Anunnaki jumped the gun on evolution and created us, Homo sapiens, through genetic engineering. This happened some 250,000 years ago. It should not surprise you to learn that the latest scientific studies in genetics confirm that all the people living today stem from a single Eve who lived in southeastern Africa 250,000 years ago. As time passed, there began the intermarriage between the Anunnaki, Nephilim, and the daughters of the Atom, which the book of Genesis mentions. This brings us to the time of the deluge, the Great Flood, about 13,000 years ago. As scholars have recognized more than a century ago, the biblical tale of the deluge, of Noah, and how mankind was saved, is only an abbreviated version of a much longer and much more detailed Sumerian text. In that text, as in all the tales that the Bible chose to include, the deeds attributed by the Bible to a single entity called Elohim, a plural term by the way, are the actions and words of many of the Anunnaki. In those texts, the main participants in the happenings are Enki and his half-brother Enlil, their half-sister Ninhursag, and their sons and daughters. In the aftermath of the deluge, the Anunnaki divided the earth among themselves. To Enki and his offspring the African lands were given. To Enlil and his offspring were given the lands of the Semites and Indo-Europeans. In those parts of earth, 3 regions of civilization were granted to mankind. The civilizations of Sumer in Mesopotamia circa 3800 BC, of the Egyptians circa 3100 BC, and of the Indus Valley circa 2900 BC. The 4th region was a sacred region, exclusive for the use of the Anunnaki themselves, as their post-diluvial spaceport. It was the name of Ninhursag, who did her best to keep the peace between the 2 quarreling clans of Enki and Enlil. This division of the earth, and the resulting establishment of the post-diluvial spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula, were key decisions that shaped the ensuing events on Earth. Among those results was the building of the 3 pyramids at Giza, and a series of wars that I have named in my books the Pyramid Wars. Before the deluge, the spaceport was in Mesopotamia, in Sumer. It involved 3 elements: the Mission Control Center, which was in Nippur, Enlil's center; the spaceport itself, which was in a place called Sippar; and a landing corridor, which was anchored at its point on the twin-peaked Ararat. Illustration D, top. In the aftermath of the avalanche of water, the valley between the 2 great rivers made Mesopotamia uninhabitable for a long time. So the spaceport was shifted to the neutral zone in the Sinai Peninsula, where the hard soil of the flat central valley made it perfect for the purpose. As before, the Mission Control Center was at some distance away, and I have suggested that it was in what was later known as Jerusalem. The landing corridor's point was again anchored on Mount Ararat's twin peaks. But on what were the 2 ends of the landing corridor to be anchored? I show the layout of the spaceport and its approaches in illustration D, bottom. You can see that one end of the corridor's 2 lines would be anchored in twin peaks in the Sinai's mountains. But where were 2 more peaks to be used for anchoring the other line? The answer of the Anunnaki was to artificially build 2 such visible markers, the 2 great pyramids of Giza. A little known fact about what is called the second pyramid is that although it is somewhat smaller than its neighbor, the Great Pyramid, it rises to the same height, because it is built on somewhat higher ground. In my books, I have reproduced Sumerian illustrations and texts that leave no doubt of their familiarity with these pyramids. The Great Pyramid was called by the same term as the ziggurat of Enlil in Nippur, Ekur, house which is like a mountain, and like it, was equipped with radiating crystals that emitted various directional beams. These were placed in specially cut niches along what is called the Grand Gallery, see illustration E, and a hollowed-out stone chest that still stands in the chamber called the King's Chamber, and a long vertical niche in what is called the Queen's Chamber. You can still see these chambers and niches, but not the radiating crystals and other wonderful equipment. It was deliberately destroyed when the most ferocious pyramid war ended with a victory for the Enlilites. This is all described in several long Sumerian texts that I fully quote in my writings. The final and most awesome war took place in the days of Abraham, the first Hebrew patriarch. It is recalled in the Bible as the upheavaling of Sodom and Gomorrah. It was then, in 2024 BC, that the Anunnaki used nuclear weapons to destroy the spaceport in Sinai and deny to Marduk, alias Ra, supremacy on Earth. This, in brief, is the story of the Anunnaki from their first splashdown in the Persian Gulf some 445,000 years ago, until the first use of nuclear weapons on Earth, some 4,000 years ago. Many find it so well documented that they join me in believing that in my books, for the first time since antiquity, the true story of Earth and mankind and its gods is being put together in a plausible scenario. Others find it all very difficult to accept. If we turn from the Sumerian, Mesopotamian, and biblical evidence to the Egyptian sources, we find that the ancient Egyptians had no problem with these conclusions. In the tomb of an Egyptian governor of the Sinai, in a series of color drawings depicting his life and achievements, one section shows very clearly a rocket ship in an underground silo. If you look at illustration F, you will see that it is shown with two operators inside it, below ground, while the command module is above ground, where palm trees grow and giraffes roam. The pharaohs, so was the royal tradition, could join the gods in an afterlife by journeying from their tombs eastward to the Sinai Peninsula, and there, sitting between two astronauts, soar heavenward in a rocket ship. The pyramids that the pharaohs built were accordingly called Stairways to Heaven, which I took to be the title of my second book. But while ancient Egyptians had no problem with all that, modern Egyptologists do. In the course of your visit to Egypt, you will hear that the pyramids were all built by the pharaohs, including the three unique ones at Giza. You will hear that they were all built as tombs in which the pharaohs were buried, and you will be told that the Great Pyramid was built by a pharaoh called Khufu. We call him Cheops. The large one next to it, the so-called Second Pyramid, by his successor, Chefra. We call him Chephren. And the third, smaller one, by his successor, Menkaure, whom we call by his Greek name, Mycerinus. This custom of each pharaoh building himself a pyramid, you will be told, began with the father of Khufu, Cheops, who was known as Sneferu, the founder of what is known as the Fourth Dynasty, whose kings reigned from about 2600 to about 2500 BC, to Menkaure, Mycerinus. Another minor feat, that of creating the Sphinx, is also attributed. There are about 30 major pyramids in Egypt, and all of them, except the three at Giza, were indeed built by the pharaohs, not necessarily one each, and not as tombs to be buried in, but rather as cenotaphs, symbolic monuments for someone buried elsewhere. While the other pyramids are elaborately decorated and covered on their inside walls with quotes from the Book of the Dead and other ancient incantations known as the pyramid texts, there is absolutely no decoration, no painting, no inscription whatsoever in the three Giza pyramids. They are unique in their size and durability. They are unique in their elaborate stone masonries. They are unique and especially the Great Pyramid, in their internal construction of chambers and corridors, whose incredible alignments reveal a sophisticated knowledge of mathematics, geometry, engineering, geography, and astronomy. The total mass of the Great Pyramid alone, estimated at 93 million cubic feet and weighing 7 million tons, has been calculated to exceed that of all the cathedrals, churches, and chapels combined that have been built in England since the beginning of Christianity. One can go on extolling the uniquely impressive features of the Great Pyramid and its companions at Giza. Our key question is this: were they built, as Egyptologists believe, in the 26th century BC by Egyptian kings Khufu, Chefra, and Menkaura, or were they built by the Anunnaki thousands of years earlier? Were these pyramids built as royal tombs, or, as I have shown, as beacons in a landing corridor for a spaceport in the Sinai? If you press the Egyptologists for evidence that the pharaohs were actually buried inside their pyramids, they will have none. They did have one example until several decades ago. That was the small pyramid here at Giza. In July 1837, an Englishman by the name of Howard Vyse, who was excavating in the area, reported that he had found near a stone sarcophagus inside this pyramid fragments of the cover of a mummy case with a royal inscription on it, together with part of the skeleton of the king's name. The name spelled out was Menkaura, the Mycerinus in the Greek language, to whom this pyramid was attributed. It was a unique discovery, because not only did it show the pyramid to have been a royal tomb, but also unquestionably evidenced the pharaoh's name. It was, as I said, the one and only instance. It also proved to have been an archaeological fraud. Scholars at the time already had some doubts about the age of the mummy case due to its style, and when a few decades ago radiocarbon dating was developed, it was established without doubt that the mummy case cover belonged not to the 4th, but to the 25th dynasty, not to 2600 BC, but to 700 BC, and that the skeletal remains were not even from the pre-Christian times, but from the first centuries of the Christian era. Someone, in other words, took a piece of a wooden coffin found elsewhere, and a skeleton from a common grave, and put them into a pile of rubble inside the small pyramid, which had been entered before many, many times, and announced, "Look what I found!" When I was writing my first book, I was not aware of this forgery, because textbooks dealing with ancient Egypt just gloss over it. Earlier textbooks repeat the tale of discovery as conclusive evidence that Menkaura built this pyramid and was buried in it. My conclusions regarding the Anunnaki and their spaceport were based on Sumerian, not Egyptian, sources at the time. But when I began to continue the story of the Earth Chronicles, and started to examine the Egyptian sources, I faced a dilemma. As I saw it, the Anunnaki and not the pharaohs had built the Giza pyramids and carved out the Sphinx, and they did it not in circa 2600 BC, but circa 9000 BC. But that is not what Egyptologists were saying, so I had to examine the evidence that the Egyptologists had. That evidence was twofold: that found in the small or third pyramid, which I have just reviewed for you, and an inscription with the royal name of Cheops found inside the Great Pyramid. Whereas the evidence found in the third pyramid was in chambers that had been entered many times before, the evidence in the Great Pyramid was in a chamber that had apparently never been entered since its original construction. The story again involves the same Englishman, Howard Vyse, and I tell it in titillating detail in my second book, The Stairway to Heaven. The black sheep of a famous English family, Howard Vyse, became fascinated with the archaeological discoveries in Egypt, and decided to use his family's money to attain fame for himself. He began by searching for a legendary secret chamber inside the Great Pyramid, which, according to rumors, held all the riches of the pharaoh Cheops. After much work and almost running out of funds, he began to use gunpowder inside the pyramid to blow his way into narrow spaces above the king's chamber. The first one was discovered in 1765 by an explorer named Nathaniel Davison. Vyse discovered 4 more, one above the other. See illustration G. The Great Pyramid, as I have stated, is totally devoid of any decoration or inscription. So was the chamber discovered by Davison, but in the 3 chambers discovered by Vyse, uncharacteristically, there were inscriptions, masons' markings and royal names, all made with red paint, and one of the inscriptions clearly spelled Khufu. Vyse, in other words, offered proof from a chamber that had been sealed off all these millennia that it was Khufu, or Cheops, whose masons had built this pyramid. He called the British and Austrian consuls in Cairo to witness the inscription. They copied it on cloth paper, signed it, and sent it to the British Museum for safekeeping. There it lay undisturbed for almost a century and a half, and textbook after textbook told its students that yes, this inscription identified the pharaoh Khufu as the builder of the Great Pyramid. So what about my Anunnaki as builders? What about the spaceport and flying vehicles and Nibiru? As I was researching the ancient evidence, something odd struck me. According to the Egyptological theory of a succession of pharaohs building a succession of pyramids, the Sphinx was built by carving the native stone by Chephren, the supposed builder of the second pyramid. He was the 4th king of the 4th dynasty. Yet, Egyptian drawings on tablets from the 1st dynasty already showed the Sphinx, illustration H. In other words, the very first pharaohs, 600 years before Chephren, already saw the Sphinx standing at Giza. Moreover, a well-known stone stela discovered in the 1850s and known as the Inventory Stela bears an inscription by Khufu or Cheops, in which he mentions not only the Sphinx, but also the Great Pyramid, as already existing in his time, about a century before his successor Chephren had supposedly carved out the Sphinx. So I asked myself, what is going on here? When I came across the fact that the so-called evidence from the 3rd pyramid was a forgery, something rang a bell. The forger was in that case Colonel Vyse. But was he not also the discoverer of the Khufu/Cheops evidence in the Great Pyramid? As I read and reread his diaries and other data concerning the activities in Egypt and Egyptology at that time, I could not shake off the feeling that the red paint inscriptions Vyse claimed to have found in the narrow chambers were also a forgery. With much behind-the-scenes diplomacy, and with a bit of luck, I was able to find, in the dusty archives of the British Museum in London, the cloth-bound testament left there by Vyse 150 years earlier. You are the first one in more than a century that is asking to see this, the curator of the Egyptian department of the museum told me. The minute I opened the folded sheets, I knew I had found the evidence for the forgery. In a nutshell, here it is. Due to poor knowledge at the time of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the assistant of Vyse, a Mr. Hill, who climbed into the chambers and with brush and red paint drew the crucial cartouches with the royal names spelled Khufu, the way I show in illustration I, but what he wrote or painted was not Khufu, but Rafu, illustration J, invoking in vain the name of Ra, Egypt's supreme god. The correct way to write it is the way I show it in illustration I. This is how you will see it written on the Inventory Stela when you visit the Cairo Museum. I submitted this and other evidence in my book, The Stairway to Heaven. A few months after the book was published, I received a letter from an engineer living in Pittsburgh. "What you say about the forgery," he wrote, "has been known in my family for the past 150 years. I called him at once. It turned out that his great-grandfather was the master mason whom Vyse had hired to use gunpowder inside the pyramid, and He wrote back home about the night Mr. Hill went into the pyramid with brush and paint and perpetrated the forgery. After 150 years, an eyewitness emerged to corroborate my conclusions. Astronomers now concur that there indeed is one more planet in our solar system. Other scientists, in geology, biology, genetics, and mathematics, corroborate other aspects of ancient knowledge. I detail all that in the other books of the Earth Chronicles series and in the latest book, Genesis Revisited. In that latest book, I also follow step by step one of the most shocking incidents in the modern space program. This is what the truth is about the spacecraft called Phobos 2 that was launched by the Soviets, with international participation to probe Mars and its moonlet Phobos. The spacecraft was hit in March 1989 by, quote, something that should not be there. I show in my book one of the last photographs transmitted by the spacecraft showing that something. What is claimed to be a subsequent photo frame has since been shown by a Russian source. It shows an elongated alien object closing in on the spacecraft. There are amazing features on Mars, not just the famous face, but also actual structures. They include what looks like the layout of a spaceport. According to the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki used Mars as a station on the way from Nibiru to Earth. That ancient spaceport has been reactivated. And, if I am right about this conclusion, then this will explain where UFOs and their android occupants come from. Earth is being scouted again, and after the android messengers, the Anunnaki themselves will follow, fulfilling all the prophecies about the return of the kingdom of heaven to earth. In confirming the conclusions about the 12th member of our solar system and the Anunnaki, we also solve the enigma of the UFO phenomenon. Some of the most compelling evidence is right here, the 3 pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx.